out, what were the pros and cons of it, what are the weaknesses and the strengths of it. So on the MMPI-2 that was administered in June 15th, 2019, Ms. Brophy's, the validity scales are letting us know this person answered in a relatively truthful way. And there are multiple ways that it can be answered that are less than truthful. So, for example, you can have a overly positive and self-management. It can look very, very virtuous. You can have an overly negative view. The people can answer randomly, and then there's elevations on inconsistency scales. It lets us know whether or not the rest of the profile is valid or not based on these validity scales. So based on the MMPI-2.
And let me stop you just for a second. We had much earlier talked about profile validity. Was that term referring to exactly what you just described?
Yes, we need the validity scales. We need the validity scales to show for a valid profile in order to have confidence in the clinical profile.
Okay, all right. So how do you use that? How do you actually apply this test and the profile validity scales? How in this case did you actually apply that to your evaluation?
Well, the MMPI-2, as I said, is somewhat dated. And so at the time of 2019, the MMPI-3 had not been fully, it was already in place, but I hadn't taken the training on it to know if I wanted to shift or not.
Right, but right now I want to focus on the MMPI-2, which I think is what you're saying too, those first two paragraphs under that psychological testing section.
Sure. So the validity scales produce a profile that we assess. Now, we key it into a computer. The Pearson testing gives us a profile. Every profile is based on a large set of data. And so with every profile, there's always a caution. On the MMPI-2, it's at the end. And then it is expected that a professional use that profile in connection with other data. The data is not meant to stand alone.
Okay. So was there such a caution on the report that Pearson returned to you for Ms. Brophy's MMPI-2?
It's on every profile.
Oh.
So, I mean, it's not just because it's Ms. Brophy. It is on any profile that you put in. This is a standard caution.
Okay.
That is done if you're going to use a computer-generated profile.
Okay. So what is that caution?
This MMPI interpretation can serve as a useful source of hypothesis about clients. This report is based on objectively derived scale indices and scale interpretations that have been developed with a diverse group of people. The personality descriptions, inference, and recommendations contained herein need to be verified by other sources of clinical information because individual clients may not fully match the prototype. This information in this report should only be used by a trained and qualified test interpreter. The test is not designed to or intended to be provided directly to clients. The information contained in the report is technical and was developed to aid in professional interpretation.
All right. So in referring back to your report on Ms. Brophy, in that section on page 8 that we were talking about, what were there some elevations and scales? Were there things that were significant in that testing? And what I'd like you to talk about the individual component parts, but then also tell us what your evaluation of her, what you drew from the test, the MMPI-2 test, and the information that was returned to you.
So with the MMPI-2, the profile was, in my opinion, mildly elevated. There's certain cutoffs, and it didn't go above that cutoff.
When you say the profile, are you talking about all profiles, or is there one in particular?
Well, her profile was mildly elevated for what is called self-favorable.
Okay.
It's a positive impression management. And self-favorable impression management is very typical in court cases, especially you see it more within, say, divorce cases or child custody cases. It varies within criminal cases depending on how the person wants to present, to be quite honest, okay? So it's a mildly self-favorable. What that tells me is that her clinical scales are probably suppressed. So if I'm wanting to make myself look good, I'm going to suppress the clinical scales. And so when I look at the clinical scales, I need to understand as a evaluator, as a psychologist, that the clinical scales are probably suppressed. And I have to take that into consideration in my interpretation of it. However, even with the outgoing, so when there's certain scales that are significantly suppressed, but for example, introversion, which is a relatively stable trait over time.
And are you talking about her in particular right now, or are you talking generally
Yeah,
about
I'm
the
talking about
test?
Ms. Brophy's social introversion scale is pretty low, which means she's not a social introvert. She tends to probably be more of an outrovert. She likes being around people. So it suppresses the scales, and we have to look at the scales and consider whether or not this suppressed scale is perhaps unduly suppressed because of the validity scales.
Okay. And what was your assessment?
My assessment is that she's gregarious, she's outgoing, she tends to be more of an extrovert than an introvert, but she doesn't meet any criteria for a psychological or psychiatric diagnosis.
And how confident are you of that assessment?
Given that, because we can't, it's one point of data. Given this point of data with her interview, with other collateral documents, I would say I'm very confident, upper 90% range.
Okay. Now, in the course of working through this and working through that question in particular, and whether there are concerns about what I think you termed a mildly self-favorable presentation, are there additional tools available to you besides your professional judgment and your intuition and your gathering of information? Are there other tools that are available to you that provide some insight into whether somebody might look very good on the surface, but there's something going on that they're hiding from you that's much more malevolent, much darker?
Sure. So the PAI and the MMPI are called personality inventories. They really don't assess personality. They assess psychological conditions and psychiatric syndromes, depression, anxiety. Okay. You can find some elevations perhaps on personality disorders, but that's not very reliable actually within. There's another test that is developed by a man named Robert Hare called the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. And that looks at psychopathy. It looks at how does someone who looks very, very good perhaps have a more malevolent side to them that is covered.
Okay, and psychopathy essentially means the person potentially is a psychopath.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, and we have to be careful because psychopathology is things like depression, anxiety. A psychopath, or psychopathic is the idea of a psychopath.
Okay, so what
more
Dr.
evil.
Hare was looking at, this test that you're talking about now, it was intended to elicit an understanding of whether the person's a psychopath, nothing having to do with depression or those other more mundane conditions, correct?
Yes,
Okay. All right, so did we ask you to administer that Hare psychopathy test in this case?
you did, but it's not administered, it's scored.
Okay, well, tell us
So,
about that. What is it and how do you go about conducting it, scoring it?
so the Hare psychopathy is a series of items.
And Mr. Britton, it might be helpful if you brought up Exhibit 357 now.
How it was developed was that Robert Hare works in the criminal justice system in Canada, And he noticed a very long time ago that some of the people who had done the most hellacious crimes were very well liked by him and his team, and then they would pull out the file and they'd see it was evil. And so they started to look at what were the traits to look for that indicated that were common among people who were psychopaths. And he developed then his revised scale came out in 1991. It's a series of really just categories. It's just traits. And you use it predominantly by using collateral documents. So the interview can be important in the fact of, is there inconsistencies that in the interview with what they are telling you? The psychological test, the PAI, MMPI can be helpful. Are there traits that you would expect to see on someone that is along the antisocial vein? So it is a consideration. But then it's just, he came up with these traits, and then you score them as not present, maybe they're present, or definitely they're present, or we admit them. And so it's broken down into 4 facets and 2 factors each. Factor 1 tends to be the more interpersonal, the more emotional aspect of it. Factor 2 is more of a lifestyle, and then the antisocial aspects, which are more within the criminal population. So we score each of those facets independently, and then they get combined to come up with either factor 1 and or factor 2. And it's as simple as plotting it on a graph to see then what level it goes in and if it meets the criteria.
Okay. So tell us how you scored. You did, in fact, do this with Ms. Brophy, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us how you actually applied that. How did you score her?
You mean
And I
individual?
don't mean the ultimate conclusion, but tell us about the process, and then we can talk about the conclusion.
Okay. As I said, one of my graduate students and I sat down with the data that we had, and we scored it actually twice. We scored it the first time as what do we just think from the data? What do we just, having met with her, having tested her, having reviewed the documents, where would we rate each of these categories? Then we went back a second time and said, if I was biased on behalf of the prosecution, how would I rate this? And where can we find like one piece of data that says, yes, we should score her as a yes, definitely on this category. And so we scored it basically twice.
Okay. And when you scored it in what you considered to be the more objective, sort of right down the middle of the roadway, what was your conclusion?
It was subclinical for it did not rise to the level of on any of the facets or factors. And again,
I have an objection, Your Honor. We don't have this material. I don't know what they're referring to.
All right, let's have the jury step out for a moment.
Unless we got that.
All right, we're still on the record. Mr. Overstreet, did you want to, I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to say or not, but.
Well, there's a reference on page 9 of Dr. Warford's report to this hair psychopathy checklist. We don't have any supporting documentation, and it seems like she's referring to some, and they've put up this exhibit.
Yeah, the
I
exhibit.
understand they've given us the exhibit, but what is she relying on to talk about this exhibit and talk about this hair
So
psychopathy checklist?
the testimony was I scored by sitting down with the data we had. And so you're questioning whether or not you've been provided that data.
Yes. including
defense-
notes, things of that nature.
Does defense want to address that? Because I don't know what she's talking about either, but I wouldn't. I haven't read any of this.
Your Honor, I believe that what she's saying, and we can of course ask her some questions about this, but this is not something that gets sent off to another company where they send back a report. We did provide the data from the 2 MMPIs and the PIA that she's been, personality, did I get that right? Is it
Personality Assessment Inventory, yes,
Okay,
PAI.
PAI. This, I think, sounds like it's just an informal scoring, like they sat down and wrote on a piece of paper. Certainly, if we'd been asked to provide that, we would have, but I don't think it is anything other than they're just tallying up for each of these categories what number they assign to it, and then coming up with a conclusion. It's not something that we've seen either, and I imagine it's just a single page of notes.
Well, I mean, let me just ask, Dr. Warford, when you said you scored by sitting down with the data that you had, what do you mean by the data?
If I may, let me take the first one, which is a glib or superficial charm. So then we look through, based on our interview, based on the collateral documents, based on the psychological testing, can we say that this is present? And
Okay,
it's-
so I think what
Okay,
he's-
so we're talking about the interview, the testing you had done, and what was the third thing?
The discovery, the collateral documents.
Okay, so I think what she's saying is that's the data.
I think that that's probably sufficient. When I'm asking, I guess, maybe I'm not saying this correctly, Your Honors, they're referring to a checklist, a revised check, which then provides the scoring. What is she working on? What is she looking at that's providing that scoring?
So you're looking for a copy of the actual hair psychopathy, I can't say it, psychopathy
Whatever she's working
Hair
on.
PCL.
checklist.
Whatever she's working on is what I'm looking for. I don't want to lock myself into, I want this document. I want what she's working on. If she's working off of a chart that has specific numbers that she's pulling from, I want that. I would also like her notes regarding that, how she came up with these numbers. And we've asked for all of this data before.
Okay, I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding what you're asking for. So, and I guess I'm making an assumption on what the hair psychopathy checklist even is. Can you tell us what that is?
It is a checklist that was developed by Robert Hare.
Okay, I got who developed it and all that. So you're holding up a document that looks like a checklist. You're saying you have not seen this.
Never seen that.
Okay, is there any reason why?
Your Honor, we don't have that either. We turned over what we thought was all of the testing data. I wasn't aware that there was another one, but her description of it has been essentially what we understood is just going through that chart and assigning I don't know if it's a 0, a 1, or a 2. I think there are 3 different choices and adding it up. So we imagined that it was something that was basically essentially scribbling on something like the exhibit that's displayed. It's not something that gets sent off to another company. It's not, as we understand it, nearly as formal a process, and it's a much shorter list of considerations. So we can make a copy of this.
Okay, so, all right, they can make a copy of that. Is there something else, though, that you're looking for?
Yes, any notes that were written around this time that helped her create these conclusions? I guess this is my concern, Your Honor. This testing was done, well, actually, I don't know when the hair psychopathy was given or determined, but some of these, the MMPI-2 was done back in 2019. The MMPI-3 wasn't done until 2021. I don't know when the hair psychopathy test was. But Dr. Warford's report wasn't written until 5 days after this trial started. So what is she relying on to draw these conclusions? That's what I'm asking for.
Well, I think she's already talked about what she was relying upon. She said the interview, the psychological testing.
No, I'm sorry, Judge, to get to those numbers, like what numbers, there's numbers assigned to these results. I don't know how she got those.
Can I see what the checklist looks like?
Certainly. May I approach?
I'll have my clerk come get it. I hadn't heard anything about numbers yet, so I guess I'm not
you-
totally following.
I do have the manual as well, if you would like to see that.
Oh, I see. So just so we're clear what we're even talking about, it looks like the checklist, which defense says they can provide, these numbers correlate, there's numbers 0, 1, and 2 that correlate to answer no, maybe, or yes. And it looks like there are, well, why don't we have this, hand this back. Hold on for just a minute. And then I guess there was a question, I just want to make sure I'm understanding, Dr. Warford. Are there notes that are attendant with the completion of this particular checklist?
No, sir. How we do it is it was a graduate student and I, we sat down, we looked, we had, and the report was finalized. I know, but the thing is that this was done way before that. It was probably done more, and I can't give you an exact date, but around the 2021 date. And we sit down and we pull out the manual, we read the description of that category, we look through the documents, we don't keep separate notes.
Okay.
And we say, oops, here, this fits, here's where this fits. Or we go, I can't find anything in there.
Okay. All
And
right.
then it just merely gets transferred by carbon. And then the numbers just, and it is validated on male or female populations. And then it just gets put
All right.
onto.
So let me ask you, Mr. Overstreet, I'm looking at the discovery requirements, and I'll throw this out to defense too. Under ORS 135.835, those are what cover defense obligation of disclosure to the state. And under number 1, it includes the names and addresses of persons, including the defendant, whom the defense intends to call as witness at the trial, together with relevant written or recorded statements or memoranda of any oral statements of such persons other than the defendant. And then the next part is any reports or statements of experts made in connection with the particular case, including results of physical or mental examinations and of scientific tests, experiments, or comparisons that the defense intends to offer in evidence at the trial. I just want to make sure I understand what you're seeking exactly. You're seeking a copy of this checklist. We've now heard there were no notes taken simultaneously with it. Is there anything else I'm missing?
I mean, I guess it's hard to know what's possibly missing. If our request for all notes and documentation has led us to this point, what I guess I would respond is, besides besides the checklist, I don't know. I imagine the checklist might answer our questions.
All right. Does defense want to be heard any further? It looks like what we're talking about, as I understand it, is this checklist. Does defense want to be heard any further?
No, I mean, certainly if there'd been a more specific request, we got all these test results, but we don't see this, we would have inquired further, but I wasn't even aware that there were.
You're saying you didn't have it. I understand. All right. Do you want, because we'll make a copy of it for you, and then you may want a moment to look at it. How much of a break do we need? Or do you know?
I have no idea. I don't know what this is.
All right, here's what we'll do. Let's make a copy for the state. We'll go on a break. I will check back in. Well, actually, in about 10, 15 minutes, just let me know.
I will, yeah, I'll check in.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go over the reference.
All right. right, please be seated. Before we bring the jury back in, I just wanted to check and see if we are okay to proceed.
Yes, Your Honor, we just certainly don't want to cause further delay. I think we can move forward with this. I just had one accompanying question with it, and there's no date on this. Can we have the answer to that before we get started?
I'm sorry,
If you
okay.
know,
All
I
right.
mean, I suppose it can be a
I was-
question for cross-examination,
Sure.
but do we know?
I know that it was before June of 2021, and the reason is because my graduate student and I worked on it together, and he left for internship in June of 2021.
That's when this was prepared.
That would have been when we did it.
Okay, I think that's fine.
Okay, all right, let's bring the jury back.
Okay, we'll go with record and I will use the weapons one.
And Ms. Weinmiller, when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hey, Dr. Warford, so this hair psychopathy checklist that you scored, did you do that in the spring of 2021?
Yes.
Okay. As an aside, I'd note that there was quite a gap there between the first testing that you did in 2019 and the spring of 2021. Was that in part related to the pandemic?
It was totally related to the pandemic. Everything shut down in March of 2020. And it was-
Okay, and it was difficult as a defense professional to get any work done during that period?
It was, I think it was difficult for much of the courts, and being able to do visitations, to being able to meet with people was very difficult.
Okay, so this checklist that we have in front of us now, it looks to me like these 20 questions on the checklist match exactly the exhibit that you've got in front of you. Are those categories exactly the same or just very close?
They're close. There's actually, and it kind of cuts it off where it says factors not loaded. So if you look on the second page, there are numbers let's see, number 17 and oh, there you go. So those two items are noted, but they don't fit into any of the categories.
Okay, all right. So the exhibit is close to this. And on this checklist, it's not broken into those categories, but I can see on the exhibit that there are factors and facets.
Yes.
Can you just briefly tell us why it's divided that way, what that's supposed to mean?
I'm smiling because there's times that a test developer does something that we can't really, we just know that they did it.
That's just what it's called?
It's just what he called it, is that
Okay.
there are these, that factor one consists of facet one and facet two. Factor two consists of facet three and facet four.
Okay, all right. So let's go to what you did. What you have mentioned a couple of times now that there's a graduate assistant that was working with you.
Yes.
What's his name?
Colton Larson.
Okay, so when you, and I'm sorry.
Colton, now it is, as of last Friday, it's Dr. Larson, but at that time it was Colton Larson, Mr. Larson.
Okay, so Dr. Larson, now Dr. Larson, and you sat down to score this together,
Yes.
right? And you had a conversation between the two of you about what score was appropriate for each of these points on the checklist?
We said, what do we think is appropriate, and what if we were really nitpicking?
Okay, hang on
Yes.
a second. But the process is with the two of you were sitting together having a conversation. Now, he's the one that you said had also done a very thorough review of the discovery and had summarized it for you.
Yes.
And the other collateral material that came from the defense, he summarized that as well?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I understand that the two of you scored this twice. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the first time you scored it, what was your approach? What were you doing?
Our first approach was, how do we, given the data that we have, would we score this? And we discussed it. We looked for what would be data that would support, excuse me, what would support saying that, yes, this is present in this piece.
Okay, so the first time you were doing it, would you describe that as an attempt to just do this in an objective straight down the middle of the roadway?
As objective as possible, yes.
Okay. Did you then decide that you would score it a second time and do it in a way that was taking the perspective perhaps of a detective or somebody who was thinking, well, I've got a different view here. And I don't mean that the detectives shade things against Ms.
Right.
Brophy, but that you specifically made an attempt to shade your answers or kind of shift your answers so that they were more harsh or more critical of her.
I think a better way of saying that is that we looked for any little piece that we could say, yes, this is it.
Okay.
And then scored it as yes.
So time two is more likely to move her towards psychopathy than time one.
That would be accurate.
Okay. So when you did it the first time, what was the result of your scoring? What did that tell you?
The score, the overall score, total score was in the, a T-score of 29. T-scores over 61 are significant, but a T-score of 29 is a total score.
Okay, and then when you did it the second time, what changed? What specifically did you shift in a direction that was more adverse or critical to Ms. Brophy?
And again, we intentionally attempted to skew it. So on the need for stimulation or proneness to boredom, we talked about her liking to travel. We were talking about her being interested in multiple things, her writing and being, staying really active in doing research for that. So that was one that we scored went from maybe to yes.
And which factor is that? What are you talking about?
Need for,
Need for stimulation, proneness
yes, it's
to
under
boredom?
under facet 3, factor 2, need for stimulation and boredom.
Okay, so you decided that because she has a love of travel and what else you would,
Lots of research looking that she isn't somebody who's just going to sit and be bored. She's
Okay.
going to be active, and so we scored it as initially as maybe meeting the criteria that's specifically spelled out by Hare, and then scored it again as if we were to say yes to that.
okay. And with respect to factor 2, which is up in that upper left-hand box, grandiose sense of self-worth, what scoring did you do there, and was it different between the two?
It wasn't. We scored it as 0. We did make the note. I remember that we talked a lot about the idea of, you know what, she's a writer, she's gregarious, she's outgoing. But there was something that she had said to us that was actually not consistent with somebody who is grandiose or narcissistic. And that was about coming to court hearings. And she didn't want to. She said, you know, it's a media circus, I'm not going to come. Where somebody who is grandiose or narcissistic would have fed on that, would have wanted that.
Okay, and was that in the context of talking about fairly minor, inconsequential, or I shouldn't say inconsequential, but
Yeah, and
kind
again,
of
we couldn't.
routine court hearings?
And again, we couldn't find any data to support that she was grandiose.
Okay, all right. What else, what are the other factors that you and Dr. Larson shifted between the two times that you scored this?
The other one, there's two other that we shifted. One was shallow affect, and that we based on the police reports that were talking about her not having a lot of emotionality to it. And there was a note about emotions as not expected, and so we moved that from maybe to yes.
Okay, so if you took that testimony or those comments in the police reports at face value and believed that she in fact was not emotional, then you would give her the score you gave her the second time?
Yes.
Okay, all right. What else?
And then the third one that we shifted, I'm sorry, there's another one that we shifted, which was a callous or lack of empathy. And I think our reasoning was very close to the same as we went from no, that was not who we saw, to maybe. But we couldn't, there's one later where we also shifted it. And so again, we were saying, if I wanted to make the argument that, yes, this exists, how would we do that? And one of the things we talked about was she had talked about, and others had talked about the sale of her business, and then Nathaniel had lost his work. And so the idea,
That when she sold Chef du Jour, that resulted in, or I'm sorry, I didn't mean Chef du Jour, the other business.
yes,
The lunch business, that caused Nathaniel some hardship.
yes.
Okay.
And so maybe, again, we moved that from no, we don't think that this trait is there, to maybe it is there. And then the third one we shifted was failure to accept responsibility for own actions. Again, we shifted that one from no to if this loss of work for Nathaniel, could that be a failure to accept? So we shifted that one from no, we don't think it's present, to yes.
Okay, all right. So even when you scored it the second time, for the reasons that you just explained, what did that scoring tell you about how she rates on that scale of psychopathy compared to the general population?
Well, it moved her up from a T-score of 29 to a T-score of 36 as a total score.
And is that clinically significant?
Anything below a T-score of 61 is not significant.
Okay, so this may sound like me putting it into lay terms, but it sounds like she was just not even close to hitting that mark that would be required to say she qualifies as somebody who presents with psychopathy.
I think a fair would be anybody who was administered this test would probably be in a T-score about 40,
Okay,
and hers is below that.
okay. So based on that, were you able to rule out psychopathy?
I did.
So let's move on to, I guess is the flip side of what you were testifying about before lunch. As a part of your work with domestic violence, are you also able to assess what healthy relationships are?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And in this particular instance, well, let's talk about the more generally first. If there is a lack of evidence of domestic violence, does that automatically tell you that the relationship, in fact, is healthy?
No.
Do you conduct an assessment? Is there sort of a positive, proactive way of looking at it to determine whether a relationship is healthy?
By using the work of John Gottman, he has developed traits of a healthy relationship.
Okay, and you've mentioned John Gottman's name a couple of times now. Is he also a doctor?
He is. Dr. Gott, he's a PhD. He's now, I guess, Professor Emeritus at University of Washington.
Okay. And what's his area of expertise? What is he known for?
He's actually a researcher and that looked at particularly couples. So he started looking at couples in the 1970s and the 1990s. He and Neil Jacobson looked at domestically violent men. And then his wife, Julie Gottman, is a therapist. So Dr. Gottman took his 1970s work with couples, which he videoed, and he wondered after 30 years if there were markers in those early relationships which predicted how long a relationship had lasted. So he went back and tracked down the 2,000 to 3,000 people and found out if they were still in the relationship, how long. Then he put the videos of them, because they had stayed at an apartment for a weekend. He took the videos and put them in groups based on how long they had been together. He began to analyze the traits down to tenths of seconds of what were the traits of the people whose relationship ended about 7 years, about 15 years, and then who had good, solid relationships after 30 years. And he and Julie, his wife, put that then into a chart, a picture of a house of, again, what are those traits?
Okay, so that was a very long-term study.
Very. And they continue to do research on it.
Okay, and they're at the University of Washington?
They're retired. Well, they're retired from the University of Washington. They still continue to train.
Okay. Mr. Breton, would you bring up 355, please? And can you, enlarge that just a little bit if you can. There, perfect, thank you. So tell us about this. This is John Gottman's house?
Yeah, it's called the Gottman House of Sound Relationships. And I think that it's the reason it's the Gottman House is, again, John was the researcher and Julie his wife is the therapist. And then they have combined on this. So again, what they found in the relationships that had lasted 30 years or more was a trust and commitment of the partners.
Let me ask you just a minute. I know he's close, he's in Washington, but have you actually gone through training with him or with them?
I actually had started a research project with him, and I got to where I was unfortunately slipping in, and I forget to call him Dr. Gottman. So when I slip and say, John, we've been to their house to do a training on the research project that we had hoped to do in Oregon.
Okay, so you are very familiar with his work.
I am very familiar. It's still times when I will email him or I'll get an email from him about something on domestic violence. So,
okay, all right. So why don't you go back to summarizing what the concept is here and how it is that under the Gottman analysis, one makes an assessment of the health of a relationship.
So, and let me apply it then to Ms. Brophy and Mr. and Mrs. Brophy, Ms. Brophy's relationship is commitment. We're looking at how long are they together? Do they have a trust each other? Obviously, they say that, but there's also in reading the text messages, you do see that as well. Love maps. John developed this in the 1970s, so I think love maps is cheesy, but he's John Gottman and he gets to call it. It's how well do you know your partner's inner world? How well can you anticipate what's going on? So for example, in some of the documents that I read, it was this idea that they anticipated each other when they were working together, that they worked so well in sync. There's a shared fondness and admiration. Same thing in the documents. I think one of the documents talked about Miss Brophy being the center of his world when she was talking to us about him. In unhealthy relationships, it's not uncommon for people to be cynical or get snide. There was never anything but fondness and admiration for Mr. Brophy's ability to pick herbs or put together menus. So there's this shared admiration and fondness. There's the turning toward instead of turning away. So in unhealthy relationships, what happens is there is, Dr. Gottman thinks of it as a bank account. You can make a deposit in the bank account, and that's the turning toward. Every time you acknowledge a partner, you turn toward a partner, you're making a deposit into that emotional bank account. You can turn against your partner, that's making a withdrawal. And it's okay to make withdrawals if you've got enough deposits. And then the third one is turning away. And turning away is just walking by the bank, not having interactions, not engaging. Of the three, the relationships that lasted 7 years had lots of turning away. They were disengaged, not connected. The relationships that lasted 15 years had turning against. So the idea is, you know what, we're fighting, but maybe we can work it out, and then finally there comes this point where we're just done. But the couples that were together for 30 years and in solid relationships had lots of turning towards, lots of daily mundane connections. And we see that again, as I said, in the text messages. A positive perspective, giving your partner the benefit of the doubt. In the documents I read, there were lots where the person would say, and forgive me for using the first name, but that was what was in the documents, was, Nancy would talk about Dan, and he was kind of a hoarder, but she knew this is what she loved him, and she had to put up with this to have this relationship. That's giving the positive perspective. How do you manage conflict? Because frankly, we all are going to have conflict. Of the three is how do we talk about it? How can we practice self-soothing? How do I regulate myself? But interestingly, the accepting your partner's influence, Gottman, everything else here, Gottman does is gender neutral, both ways. Accepting your partner's influence is the only one that John Gottman genders, and he found that in healthy and unhealthy relationships, the woman was open, in healthy and unhealthy heterosexual relationships, the woman was open to the man's influence. But it was only in healthy relationships, or one of the traits of a healthy relationship was that the man was open to her influence. So when we hear Dan call Ms. Brophy management, he's open to her influence. He's open, you see that in the text as well. She'll make a suggestion and he'll say, that's a good idea, or something kind of to that. And so you manage conflicts, not by avoiding them, but by approaching them in a way that is not escalated or volatile. Making life dreams come true. How do you compromise? How do you both come to get what you both want? And that again was, do you have similar goals? But you don't even need to have similar goals for your future to still compromise. If I may, Dr. Gottman gives the example of a couple. She inherited a farm in Iowa. His dream was to sail around the world. There's no oceans in Iowa, just in case you wondered. And so what they did instead is they sailed for a year, parked their skiff wherever, and went and lived on the farm for a year. So it's still working together. And how do you work together to build these life dreams? And then the creating shared meaning are really rituals of connection. Dr. Gottman is big about whatever your particular, perhaps religious or family traditions are. Those are the ways that we build connection. And so engaging in these creating meaning. So Dr. Gottman is Jewish, so he'll put it within that the Jewish perspective, but he is very much about what are your everyday rituals? What are your rituals once a week or daily to connect to your partner? And this is how you create a shared meaning. And as I said, the collateral documents that I saw had evidence of each of these categories.
Okay. So based on all of that information, the information available to you, what was your assessment of the health of the Brophy relationship?
It appeared to be a healthy relationship.
Um, and how often do you say that with some confidence?
As I said earlier, I tend to say, in general, it's a healthy relationship, but one of the things that added for the Brophies was age. Sometimes as we get older, the things that bothered us when we were younger just aren't that important. Having somebody there who can hold our hand or talk or I can be comfortable with because I have this long relationship with becomes more important. And that would be consistent with the work of, say, like, well, not Kohlberg, but certainly Carol Gilligan and some of the other who looked at developmental stages.
Okay. With the Brophies, is there a caveat? Is there a but? Yes, it looks healthy, but?
Not that I could find. If there is, I couldn't find it, and I looked.
Right. So let's turn now to talking about something that you learned a great deal about from your work with domestic violence and others in your career, and that is trauma, the effect of trauma on a person. And I want to focus you as we go through this on a particular type of trauma. There are, as you've already discussed, many, many different kinds of trauma and different sources of trauma. But I'd like you to focus on the kind of trauma that comes about from a very sudden, very unexpected, and very personally significant event. And ask you, what are the terms that are used in your field to describe those kinds of events?
Well, are you asking like what are the components that make something traumatic?
No, I'm asking whether when an event is very sudden, very unexpected, and very, very personally significant, is there a term to describe that type of shock or trauma?
Well, it triggers the limbic system for the fight, flight, freeze, or faint piece. But there is again, I think it's the vernacular of just being a shock or something being catching us off guard is can be traumatizing. Not everything that catches us off guard is traumatizing.
Right, right. So let's back up a little bit. So obviously, the trauma can come from a variety of sources, right? There's the trauma that one can experience from intrafamilial violence, correct? And there's the trauma that can come from conflict with childhood peers or peers at any point in one's life, workplace conflict. There can be trauma that comes about as a result of physical pain from a physical accident, like a motor vehicle accident, something like that. Traumas that come from an anticipation of physical pain, not even an actualized event, but something that comes so close that one is certain it's about to happen, right? And then,
If you could answer two questions, either yes or no, just because we're being recorded. I mean, I see,
Yes, sir.
we can all see what you're doing, but yeah,
Yes, sir.
all right.
and without going through all the kinds of trauma, then there are also the kinds of trauma that you were describing earlier, some of wartime experiences and things that lead to, lasting difficulties integrating again into society, the sorts of things that are a combination really of physical distress, but also psychological distress that's brought upon by wartime. Do those various, multifaceted kinds of traumas, do those essentially manifest in a similar reaction within the body's response to trauma?
Well, trauma rewires the brain, and the body does react also to so often we tend to think of things as coming from the thinking part of our brain, but we get reactions, just, we'll hear about people saying a gut reaction, we'll hear about the emotional aspect. So there's a neurobiology of trauma that is universal to the human condition.
Okay. And then how long has trauma been viewed within your profession as a function of neurobiology?
Oh, not long, actually. It started to shift in late 1990s. Stephen Porges suggested what's called a polyvagal theory. And so, again, John Briere out of UCLA, Bessel Bennicock,
Can you
started,
pull that down just a little bit?
yeah,
It's a-
sorry,
I know you've been talking a long time, sorry.
hold on a second. So the work, the understanding of trauma is actually a relatively new concept. It only made its begin to make its headways in the 90s, and then understanding the neurobiology of it. It started again with theories that then were later confirmed by the research of neurobiologists, brain scans, MRIs, functional MRIs, those sorts of things.
Okay, so with the advent of technologies like fMRIs, was there a recognition within the field that the way people's brains were functioning, the images that were being produced, had some similarities, even though the source of trauma could be quite disparate?
Yes.
And what did the studies, I presume that provoked some curiosities and some follow-up? What did the studies that followed that discover? What came about as a result of seeing those similarities and the actual changes that were occurring in the brain about what was causing those changes?
Well, again, we've known about, things like adrenaline for a very long time. We've known about cortisol for a very long time. But as there were more research done on the neurobiology of it, it was the role that adrenaline and cortisol played in changing the brain, changing sizes of aspects within the brain, how it impeded maybe memory or impeded ability to restrain emotionality. So the understanding of the way that it all worked jointly is probably the biggest, I think, advance in the last 20 years.
Okay. Mr. Britton, would you put up Exhibit 356, please? And you mentioned just a little bit ago the limbic system. Can you kind of walk us through that diagram? And specifically, I want you to do it in relation to, you can start wherever you want, but what I want you to get to is in an instance of somebody undergoing very significant trauma, what would you expect to see, or what do you know would be occurring in the limbic system and in the brain?
So this slide is very good at depicting, again, the brain itself and how the components of it. And we're going to be most interested in the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the limbic system. And if possible, could we go to the next one, because it's a better one in terms of functionality.
Absolutely.
But this one is more accurate in terms of the structures. Okay.
Okay, so the other one she's talking about, I believe, is 358, Mr. Britton.
And so when the limbic system gets alerted, and I'm hesitating because there's huge debate within the field of what constitutes the limbic system and what's in it and what isn't in it. This was one that I developed 20-some years ago to explain trauma's response, the brain's response to trauma. So may I point, okay. And see. I can actually be quite loud if I need to be. I'll try to do that. So it,
reflects, this is exhibit 353. She had mentioned 358. I just want to make sure the record's clear on what we're looking at.
Well,
There is no 358.
Or someone had mentioned 358.
I accidentally mislabeled this. This is 358.
Then we don't have that. We also didn't have.
All right, so just so the record reflects, we're looking at something that has the number 353 on, but that parties are referring to as 358.
So if we think of the brain as, and forgive me, have I done this in this portion of the
I don't
hearing?
think so.
All right, so let me give you an overview of this. The easiest way to understand the brain is, and this is based on the work of Dan Siegel's way of explaining it. If you think of your forearm as our spinal cord, the corpus callosum, the cerebellum, this is the part that takes care of breathing and our basic functions, and is again the most primitive part of our brain. Then we have parts of the limbic system. This is the amygdala. It's the seat of fear and of aggression. The hypothalamus is the seat of meaning. Hippocampus is going to come in later. And then wrapped over it is the cortex, the thinking part of our brain, the adult part of our brain. Executive functioning, logic, rational thought, that comes to this part, okay? When there is a trauma or something that is shocking or catches us off guard, Dan Siegel calls it flipping your lid. The thinking part of our brain, the frontal cortex, goes offline because it takes 0.21 milliseconds to get triggered. The limbic system only takes 0.21 milliseconds. In brain terms, incredibly long time between the thinking part of our brain and the cortex, the limbic system. When the limbic system gets triggered, it alerts the entire, I guess I don't need this, the whole neuroendocrine system starts going into functioning. The adrenal gland, which is on top of our kidneys, starts pushing out adrenaline. Our heart rates go up. Our breathing can get more shallow. We're preparing for fight, flight, freeze, or faint. Then the adrenaline is not so good for our internal organs. So after that comes cortisol, and cortisol floods our system to get the adrenaline out. It's not good for our internal organs either. So the hippocampus plays a role in getting cortisol out of our system. The problem is the hippocampus also plays a role in memory, in encoding memory and wiring memory. So when there is an incoming stimuli, and it can be something external. So we have something coming in from the outside. It can be something you see, something you hear. If you were traumatized by a smell when you were young, if something you smell, it's some external stimuli is coming in, and it is alerting the hypothalamus that there is a danger here. It's not going through our thinking part of our brain. It's alerting that there's a danger. Be aware. If at some point somebody had hurled this at my head, it is a benign object. But because they had hurled it at my head at some time, now I'm going to react to this as if it's a dangerous thing, even if you were not the one who had hurled it at my brain, okay, at my head, okay? So I'm going to react to this. It alerts my hypothalamus that there is a danger here. My hypothalamus alerts my amygdala. Whoa, be ready. It's a fear and aggression. My amygdala alerts my entire neuroendocrine system, and the whole thing takes on a life of its own. As I said, the hippocampus is going to play a role in getting cortisol, but also encoding memory. So in that moment, we tend to get tunnel vision. Our hearing tends to go narrow. We're focused on one thing. If you ask me something over here, it's going to take me a minute to reorient, and I may not be able to give it to you very quickly or very accurately. So once the whole system gets triggered, it can take between 20 minutes and 4 hours for it to get back to baseline, which is why, for example, in police officer shootings, we don't interview officers right away because it takes a while to get recomposed once you've been given shocking information.
So let me ask you a question about, you were talking about the evolution of this understanding in psychology coming from the advent of things like the fMRI. So when you see a result, a brain changing color, you see something on the fMRI, are you actually in some ways watching a change in the chemistry that's coming from, for example, adrenaline or cortisol, or what is it that the fMRI is telling you?
Well, again, functional MRIs are about how the brain is lighting up at that point in time.
Right.
But when they have done studies looking at what lights up, and the training I took where that was most brought to the forefront was, again, Bessel van der Kolk's out of Boston. And it is this idea that the whole system, it's not just the brain, it's the whole system begins to react and takes longer to kind of come back to baseline the closer it is to home.
Okay. And I guess what I'm asking you is, and we don't need to get too in the weeds here, but is at least a good part of what you're describing an actual chemical change, a change in brain chemistry?
It's more of a flooding of adrenaline and then a dropping of it.
Okay.
And then that's the cortisol, and then it comes slowly back up to baseline.
Okay. So with respect to the impairment of memory that you've just described, does the type or the severity of the shock have an impact on that?
Sure. I mean, I would say in general, yes. There's some studies which seem to imply that if there's a long history of traumas, then the person might shut down. That's the fainting. Or the freezing piece. So I think that we don't know yet why somebody will fight, flight, freeze, or faint. There's some indications that it may be social training, it may be personality that help determine, but in general, the more severe the trauma, the more we're expecting to see changes in the reactions. And it's not universal,
Okay. You said fight, flight,
freeze or faint.
freeze, or faint. Okay, couldn't remember the third one. Is it possible with all of those reactions that you might also see some impairment in memory?
Especially because, as I said, once there's the flood of cortisol, it is impeding the neural pathways firing. And so the memory doesn't get transferred from the different levels. So we tend to think in three primary levels. Sensory level, so what I see is when I walked in, there's something behind me. When I walked in, I saw it. Until I turned around, I couldn't remember. It goes from the sensory level to short-term to long-term memory. And so you've got impairment in there because of the cortisol. It doesn't get wired into the long-term memory.
Okay, and does your body tend to, I'm sure one person's different from the next, but would you expect, or is it known whether a person's body releases essentially the same amount of adrenaline every time they're scared, or it has the same level of cortisol response, or is that thought to be responsive to the severity of the trauma, the severity of the shock?
That's thought to be, again, it's universal in that it happens. The amount would be more individualistic.
Okay, but I'm asking whether in addition to being individualistic, it's responsive to that particular shocking or traumatic event.
Sure. Because what one person may find shocking or traumatic, another person may not.
Right, but I'm asking for a particular person. If I have a shock because I don't get a result that I'm expecting on something, like a test or something like that. It's a shock, but it's not going to change the course of my life. But I have a shock that a sibling dies suddenly. It's something that's much more significant to me in the scope of my life. Would you expect that adrenaline response that I have is going to vary with the severity of the shock, even though it's me having both traumatic events?
Yes, and it would also, whether or not it was, so there's three components for something to be traumatic. It has to be negative valence, meaning the pros and cons, the negative is heavier, more weight. There's suddenness, it's kind of unexpected, and then there's a lack of controllability within it. So those components are necessary, but not necessarily sufficient for trauma. So your death scenario would also depend on if you've got somebody with a long-term illness or somebody who's very healthy and then shockingly has died. That's going to make a difference as well.
Okay, so these three factors that you just mentioned have to be present, the negative valence. Now, what exactly does that mean?
So, and I apologize, pre-COVID, that what I'd use as an example was the idea of inoculations for children, right? It hurts to get the shot, but it prevents long-term polio, okay? So that has a positive valence. When you weigh the two, the positive is higher than the negative. And negative valence is when you weigh the two, negative valence, there's much, much less value to it, much less, it just has a negative impact on it.
So negative valence, is it fair to paraphrase that or term that in a more colloquial way as something that's just unequivocally bad?
Yeah, more bad than good.
Okay. And then suddenness, I think you described that as you were using the analogy of a long-term illness, Alzheimer's or a cancer or something. It's very, very painful, but you would come to terms with it over time. It wouldn't be shocking. It would just be sad and depressing.
Correct.
Okay. So if it is unequivocally bad, it is sudden. You had no time to prepare for this. right?
Unexpected, yeah.
Okay, and then lack of controllability. Tell us a little bit more about that.
And we have to be careful of the illusion of control. So if I am speeding and I know that if I get caught, I'm going to get a heavy ticket. I know there's, if I'm a kid, my parents may take away my car. So that's negative valence, okay? And I get into a car accident. They may be sudden, but I had a level of controllability in there. I had a level, and that is that I could have done something. There's that knowledge that I could have done something different. So when there's a lack of controllability, most of us as humans want to think, what could I have done different? And when there is no controllability in the situation, those three, as I said, are necessary. But you can have those three and not have trauma, but you can't have trauma without those three.
Okay, so just focusing for a second more on that lack of controllability. If I get in an accident, and of course I wasn't anticipating the accident, but I know I was speeding, I know I was texting, and that sort of like, oh gosh, you should have known better, you kind of brought this on yourself, that's likely to make it less traumatic?
It is because I have a level of controllability. I could have controlled it.
Okay,
Okay.
all right,
But
that
when
makes
something is
sense.
totally outside of my control, it has a negative impact on me and it's unexpected.
Okay, so if these factors are present, then it is certainly possible to have a traumatic response. We don't know for certain it'll happen, but it's possible.
Sure, yes.
Okay. Does the degree of the shock, the degree of the suddenness, the degree of the fact that it's unequivocally bad, the degree of just the feeling of helplessness, a complete lack of control over the situation, is that going to affect the traumatic response, the degree of traumatic response?
In terms of the chemical reaction,
Uh-huh.
well, again, when it's that shock, that's what's going to kind of go into the hypothalamus that there's a danger here, something bad has happened. And then it sets the limbic system, so it can.
Okay. And if that response rose to the level of actually disrupting the cortisol and the process that you were describing earlier, actually disrupts memory, would that be more likely with a shock that is extreme, that is unexpected, that is something that really is going to be life-changing? It's unequivocally bad.
Yeah, the thinking part of our brain has gone offline, and if we tend to be thinkers, we're trying to grasp for it. And so again, it may not show externally. I may be very good at covering externally, but I'm trying to find homeostasis. I'm trying to find balance again.
Okay, so explain again how that disruption, specifically I'm asking you now about memory disruption, not just the pain part of it, but he described, I think, a feeling of blood pressure rising, the adrenaline response, the cortisol response. Could you walk us again through how those things specifically can create a situation in which memory is disrupted?
So when we're faced with something that can be a danger in the current, or if we are reminded of something, that's the incoming stimuli, of something that was dangerous to us in the past. I use the water pitcher. So if I have, let me start with that one, which is that if I've had a past trauma with this water pitcher, I'm going to react to it. I'm going to viscerally have feelings about it. I may start doing some very strange movements to try to move it away from me. That is when there's a history of trauma. However, if I am sitting here talking to you and I have never had a problem with a water pitcher and somebody unexpectedly walks up, I'm going to assume that they're getting the water and instead they, hurl it at my head. It's going to obviously be disruptive. It's going to take me a moment to kind of figure out what's going on. And so that would be something that's really relatively minor because it may not be life-changing, but it was shocking. It was negative balance, it hurt. It was sudden, unexpected, and I had no control over it. But now if it's something bigger that is going to be it'll take me a bit to orient to it. But if it's bigger, if it is the loss of someone I love, someone who is very dear to me, that's going to try to make it's going to make my world try to figure it out, because now I've got to figure out a bigger piece than what I'm doing in this moment that I've been hit with this water pitcher.
So let me ask you, though, about a situation that doesn't involve two different episodes, right? Because in the analogy that you just gave us, the water pitcher is thrown at you one day, and that is shocking, and obviously it hurts like heck, and there's just nothing good that came from that. But then you are describing a response that you're having on a later day to seeing the same water pitcher, one that looks just like it.
Or one that just looks like just right. Or even the memory of it
Right.
can do the same thing.
Right, but what I'm asking you about now is a disruption to memory the very first time the shocking thing happens, how that works.
It will, as I said earlier, 20 minutes to 4 hours. If I haven't had a history of being beaten up before, it's probably be on the lower end of that spectrum in terms of for me to regroup. And because, again, I can walk away from this. There's nothing, it's going to be lower end. If it was something more life-changing, so for example, if someone came in and said, somebody threw a pitcher at your husband's head and he's dead, that's going to take more because there's more facets in my world that I have to consider of what that means and how that works together and the disbelief of it.
So the severity of the shock, I think you're in some ways circling back to something I'd asked you about a little while ago. The severity of the shock will have cause a different traumatic reaction. The traumatic reaction itself, all of that consequence that's happening physiologically within your body, is different and larger if the shock is larger.
Yes. More important. I'd say, rather than larger, I'd say more important to you.
Okay.
More salient to you.
You're right. You put that in a good way just now. If it is something that has consequence that will be lifelong for you, and it will affect every part of your life, it's just hugely significant. And so your brain has many, many, many aspects of that consequence to consider. You're saying that physiological response that you have will last longer, and that with that, there is also that potential for a memory disruption toward the longer end of that spectrum that you described to us of 20 minutes to 4 hours.
Yes.
So when that occurs, when the shock is big enough to actually cause that to happen, and it's fairly significant memory disruption in terms of the length of time, what does that disruption actually look like? Does that always mean that everything is gone, that there's just no memory left at all, or what's known about what happens to what otherwise would have been memory?
Well, it again depends individually. If the person is a tendency towards emotionality, then you're going to see lots of crying, lots of maybe if their tendency is to be angry, there's going to be this volatility. If their tendency is to be more cognitive, more of a thinking end, again, there may be some latencies and delays in their answering questions if you're asking them a question that's different than what their brain is trying to figure out. So that part is going to be individual. But the more intricate that, so I had said, if it was my husband, that goes into all parts of my brain, my history and my feelings and my plans for the future and my plans for dinner. I mean, it goes through all parts of my brain. This is only going to go to, oh my goodness, what happened right now. So the more an event is wired, I mean, the precedent to that event is wired throughout my brain, the longer it's going to take, the more impactful it's going to be.
Okay, so that could put it toward the longer end of that range of 20 minutes to 4 hours. What I'm also curious about is, though, had the traumatic event not occurred, you probably would have formed normal memories for that period of 20 minutes to 4 hours, whatever that period of disruption was, correct?
Right.
Okay, so when the disruption occurs, because you've had this unequivocally bad, sudden, unexpected, uncontrollable thing happen to you, and it's a big deal. It's not an everyday shock or an everyday trauma. It's really significant. When that happens, there's that time period there where the memory hasn't formed or done whatever it would do normally. What happens to what would have been that memory? Where did that go?
It doesn't get wired. It doesn't get hardwired into long-term memory. So that's what people will talk about going through a fog. As a nation, we kind of did that in 9/11, right? In those days after we're trying to figure out what was going on, we're going through this fog. And so, we can remember really visual aspects of it, perhaps, but we may not remember the more nuances. So you end up going on automatic pilot. You do what your body does what it knows to do, but it may not wire the memories of the events that have actually been going on.
Okay, and when that happens, and maybe, maybe science just hasn't gotten to this point yet, and if that's true, that's a fair answer, but when that happens, is it known whether the memory typically is entirely wiped out for that period of time, or whether it's just not, it's not coming together to form a complete picture the way it normally does? It's, like the indexing is off, but some of the pieces of it are there somewhere. Do we have an understanding yet of what actually happens to those things that would otherwise create a nice whole contiguous memory?
We don't have it that precise. We do know that if there's a disruption from from the sensory level, the short term, it's not going to get into short term. If there is a disruption from the short term to the long term, it's not going to get into the long term. And if you asked me months or years afterwards, something that would have been long-term memory, I may not have an answer for you on that because it didn't get wired.
Okay, now as a therapist, going back to your clinical practice and putting that hat on, if I came into you and I said, my child had this horribly traumatic event and I want you to work with her to try to get her past that and to be able to actually recall and process this and then move on. It seems like there's a big memory gap there. Is there a therapeutic technique that can help restore that memory?
Not if the memory wasn't wired into the long term. Depending on the age of the child, and so I worked with small children. I never worked with younger than 5 who had been sexually or physically abused. And we do play therapy with them, and they can reenact some of it because it's not verbal. It's harder, say, with adolescents because they're verbal.
Well,
Yeah.
that probably wasn't a good example because of that, the verbal maturity. Let's say I come into you and I say, I was in a horrible accident. I don't have brain damage, but it was terrifying to me. And there are pieces of that day that I just can't bring back. And it's important to me to be able to do that so that I can move on. I really want not to have a spotty memory anymore. And I'm kind of alarmed by the fact that I can't do this. Would you have a technique for actually helping me recreate that?
No, I would have a technique for helping you calm your body and come to acceptance that it didn't get wired, and you probably are not going to be able to recall that memory in its fullness. I'm going to explain to you that traumatic memory is like snapshots out of sync, where non-traumatic memory is like a video. And we're going to normalize that aspect of your experience. You know, we might, it's called confabulation, which is not what we want to do, which is that we make up something to put in that hole. But that memory, if it's not wired into long term, it's not there. But the body remembers. So it's again like, you know, if you close your eyes and you get beat up, we can't tell who hit me, but I know it hurts. And so I may have a memory of this pain, but in court I may not be able to say, you know, George hit me. All I can say is there were these people, I closed my eyes, I remember getting hit, my body remembers, but I can't tell you who swung, because one, it didn't have the visual aspect to put it in, but two, the trauma of it, of just trying to heal. The other aspects may not go into long-term memory that I can recall later.
Okay, so the therapy isn't really directed to, at least in the current state of the science, this therapy is not in any way directed to bringing back the memory, but rather helping the person become functional again to move on.
Correct.
Thank you. I've got no further questions now.
All right, I know that the jury has had a number of breaks, but the parties have not. So we will take our afternoon break before we start cross. Let's be back on the record at 3:30.
Okay, we'll go on the record and be all rise.
right, please be seated. And when the state is ready for cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Warford, you talked a lot with defense about how you were basing your conclusions or your opinions, and you talked about the available data to you. So I want to talk to you about that just for a minute. Ms. Weinweller went over some of the available data that you had talked about. So briefly, you had obviously you talked to Ms. Brophy herself.
Yes.
And you got that's part of, as a psychologist, when you're doing these types of evaluations, you need to have that interview with the subject themselves, correct?
Yes.
You really can't do much else without that.
Right.
Okay. And, but in this case, obviously you're being asked to analyze a relationship. You weren't able to have any access to anything about Dan Brophy, is that correct?
Not from Dan Brophy.
Not from Dan Brophy.
You know,
And so,
again, indirectly with other witnesses, other observers.
okay, and that's what I want to ask about. So it looks like you list 28 items that you used as collateral sources of information.
Yes.
It is true that you had 31 reports provided to you from the defense in this case of interviews that defense investigators did with witnesses. Is that correct?
I know that there were more than I listed, yes.
Okay. But you only list 12. Is that a yes?
Give me a second, 15 to 20, yes.
So can you explain how you picked those 12?
Some of them were names that in the interview of Miss Brophy she had mentioned already. Some of them, you know, there were ones that I didn't list that I looked. It was kind of like, you know, we saw this person walking their dog, and those were just so brief. There was nothing in there to put. But the ones that I actually ended up using are the ones that I listed in here. And then there were other ones that it became redundant because I just could not find data
You
that
found
was different.
Sorry. You found some of these defense interview reports to be redundant?
In the sense that they kept saying, you know, they had this great relationship. Boy, they worked really well together. So they were confirming for each other.
And a lot of those reports were sometimes as little as one paragraph. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that was right. Most of them, I think, were one page, if I remember right.
And you're saying you picked these, excuse me, because, well, just like you explained, but you included a report by James Denny. Why did you choose that one?
I believe he was the man who did their landscaping, wasn't he?
So he was interviewed twice. Which report did you rely on?
The one that is, it looks like it was dated 26. I'm thinking the 20220216 was the one that I relied on.
Okay. And you relied on one by Cheryl Nelson. But isn't it true that Cheryl Nelson never even met Dan Brophy?
A second, because remember there were three components, and so the part that was about Nancy Brophy would not have necessarily needed the Dan Brophy aspect in it. Yeah, so the Cheryl Nelson one is included under the first question, which was, again, somebody who had known her long-term. And that also then translates into some of the, on the hair psychopathy in terms of, you know, short-term superficial relationships. So again, those long-term relations. So I included her because she gave insight into Miss Brophy. But you're right, she probably didn't have much contact.
There was three people, Shayna Greenlick, Tamara Alva, and Vicky Schmal, that all had knowledge of their relationships, but you chose not to include those, correct?
But the best I can say is that I did not include those.
Okay. And so you chose to include 12 of the 31 interviews. You referred to a letter written by Nancy Brophy to Dan Brophy. You referred to their text messages between the two of them.
Yes.
There's really only 4 items that you referred to that were not really provided to you by the defendant herself or the defense team. Is that correct?
Everything was provided by the defense team.
I guess I mean generated.
The things that were, in my understanding, not generated by the defense team was the Brophy family interview, the Brophy phone call, the Lynn Dining interview, Nathaniel's interviews, Nancy Brophy's interviews, and the death notification pieces.
Okay. So the death notification is actually Nancy Brophy talking, though. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
So
and-
she's in control of her answers. So I'll take that one off. And then the Nancy Brophy interview, I think you're talking about the same thing. But the Brophy phone call, meaning Nancy Brophy's phone call, take that one off because that's her speaking. Is that correct?
That is her, yes.
Okay. So besides the Brophy family interview, the Glendenning interview, and Nathaniel's interview, there's nothing else here that you're relying on that wasn't actually generated by the defendant herself, meaning it's her statements, or generated by the defense in preparation for trial.
Well, I'm not sure that I agree that the Nancy Brophy interviews were generated by the police officers who were interviewing them. So,
But
I
it
mean,
is Nancy Brophy speaking and in control of her own answers.
but she's not in control of the questions.
Oh, okay, we'll get there, don't worry.
Okay.
Okay, so, but you did have access to all the police reports in this case,
As I recall, yes.
but you didn't rely on them?
I'm not to address the ultimate issue. And so there wasn't things in there that would have fallen within the purview of the parameters I was given to evaluate.
So out of about 178 people involved in this case, you chose to rely on 12 to 15 of them?
Out of all of the people who were interviewed, and as you know, many of them were interviewed, again, where you're walking your dog, and so there's probably a lot of people that were interviewed. But yes, I limited it to people who, so for example, the family, and then Nathaniel,
And the 12 people listed by defense?
and the 12
I
interviews.
guess really 13, right? Because there's also Darla. Well, no, she's listed as well. Okay, so let's say 12. So is it fair to say, characterizing all 12 of these, very favorable comments towards Nancy Brophy?
Sure, that'd be fair.
In fact, not a single negative comment towards Nancy Brophy. Is that correct?
Isn't that odd? Yes, I mean,
It is
most
odd.
people have, and that's how highly esteemed she was.
Right, by those 12 people. Not necessarily the 166 other people involved in this case.
And again, it becomes redundant. You can't do a report that would include all of that. I mean, my report is already 24 pages, and then if you add all of that, it'd be unwieldy.
Right, in fact, you spent one of those pages, we'll get to that. So I just want to make sure that we're basing everything that you're saying, all of your opinions, all of your conclusions are based on that very limited information that we just talked about.
Sure. I'm not sure I would consider it limited, but if that's how you wish to
Okay.
portray it, sure.
Were you aware there's over 5,000 pages of discovery in this case?
I knew that there was a lot. That's why I had a graduate student kind of reviewing and taking out the redundancies.
Okay, so I'm going to get to the testing that you chose to do in this case. And the first one that we heard about was the MMPI-2
Yes,
that you did on July 15th, 2019. Is that correct?
correct.
Okay. And I want to read to you what is in the pretrial criminal interpretive report. And you don't have a copy of this, correct?
I do now. We grabbed one. We had one printed off.
Oh, you didn't have one this
I
morning?
did not have one this morning. I
Have
have one now.
though.
Okay.
Okay. So page 3, under profile validity, it says this individuals undergoing pretrial evaluations, such as Ms. Brophy, and that's what this is, correct? Who present this pattern are denying problems in an extreme manner. Individuals who present this pattern on the MMPI-2 appear to have consciously distorted their responses to create the impression that they are extremely moral and virtuous and have no personal shortcomings. Did I read that correctly?
You did, and again, it's a computer-generated output, but yes, you did.
Right, based on the data that was put in this system.
Based on the combination of the actuarial reports and the data, yes.
So it's not boilerplate language that appears in every report. It's based on the data that's put into this report.
It's still boilerplate, pretty much.
Based on the data that's put in.
Based on the data that's put in.
Thank you. It goes on to say, they describe their essential difficulty in a manner to escape personal blame. Their lack of cooperation with the testing appears to be designed to avoid showing any psychological weakness and appear responsible and in control of their lives. Did I read that part correctly?
You did. You read well.
And so this is what's generated when you input that data into the MMPI, which is based on the information that we just went over. All that really favorable stuff to Nancy Brophy.
No.
It's
No,
not?
no, because the MMPI is it's a booklet and then an answer, true or false answer sheet.
This is a different evaluation. This isn't something you're taking all that information. This is a separate test, essentially.
So I'm sorry, I misunderstood that. It's not, this is from the actuarial data that was done by Pearson in their research. Yes, it is not geared towards individual. That's why the caveat at the end that cautions.
Right, and you mentioned that, and you said it, I think I quoted you correctly here. It says, may need to be tweaked based on the individual.
Yes.
And on the next page, on the bottom paragraph, it says, the practitioner should carefully weigh the individual's motivation for producing these invalidating conditions and determine the extent to which the individual's cooperation might be obtained for retesting.
Yes.
So, I mean, I want to sort of summarize this, or I guess break this down a little bit. I mean, essentially is what you're saying, that the answers that Ms. Brophy's given to these questions are self-serving. They're meant to make her look better than she probably actually is.
Based on the actuarial data of the MMPI-2. Yes.
Of the MMPI-2. Great. So let's go over to the MMPI-3. And I will direct you to page 8 to start. And just under the synopsis, it says the scores on the substantive scales indicate emotional dysfunction. Is that correct?
Where are you at?
Page 8 under synopsis.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, to continue that sentence though, and the finding is within emotional internalizing, which was that there was suicidal ideation.
Right. And you gave this test in March of 2021.
Yes.
And when you met with Ms. Brophy in June of 2019, you didn't observe that.
The suicidality.
Yes.
Hold on a second. She denied at that time that it was imminent. She acknowledged at that time that she'd had thoughts of suicidality about the time of Dan's death.
Okay.
Let me look really quick at what the PAI showed.
We're getting to the PAI.
Okay.
I'll have you turn to that, page 5 of the PAI. And again, just to make sure the jury knows what we're talking about here, we're talking about the personality assessment inventory.
Yes.
On page 5,
And I don't have that one. I just have the MMPIs.
did administer this test, okay?
Yes.
But you don't have it?
Right.
Maybe we can provide you with a copy.
Or, let me read over my notes of it. Oh, thank you.
I'll have you turn to page 5 before I ask you any questions.
All right.
And you sort of, before I get started, you sort of qualified your comments on the MMPI 2 about the forthrightness of Ms. Brophy. Basically saying, well, that's the MMPI 2. Are you saying the MMPI 2 is not valid?
I'm saying that there are problems with the MMPI 2, which is why they revalidated it and the MMPI 3 came out.
Right. And so is there problems with the PAI as well?
Well, the PII is again looking at, it's not based on actuarial data. It's not based on criterion keying. It's based purely on the literature and the symptoms that one would have within that.
Are there any problems with it?
Not that we know of. Again, we would look at I was looking at the validity scales, and so again, it has a mild elevation on the positive impression management and an inconsistency, which again is not,
We'll get there. I'm just
Okay.
asking if it's a valid test.
it appears, the test itself is valid, yes.
Okay. So this one doesn't come with qualifications, like the MMPI 2.
In terms of caveats, let me look at something. Not within this, there are sometimes there's ones that pop up, something that I do have a caveat to, but not with this one.
Great. So page 5 says, however, there appears to have been some inconsistent responses to similar items, and this inconsistency could affect test results. Thus, the interpretive hypotheses that follow in this report should be viewed cautiously.
Sure, it's one point of data, yes.
Okay? And then another point of data. The respondent may not have answered in a completely forthright manner. The nature of her responses might lead the evaluator to form a somewhat inaccurate impression of the client.
Yeah, and the problem with the,
Well, first of all,
go ahead, yes.
is that, I want to make sure, I read that right? Is that
You did
correct?
read that correctly.
And this is another data point?
It's another data point.
Okay. And I want to move to another data point.
But that's a bit misleading in terms of, because what the elevation and the inconsistency is what would lead to this. These are not two separate things.
Okay, we'll get there.
Okay.
Next page, page 6, says, of responses suggests that she tends to portray herself as being relatively free of common shortcomings to which most individuals will admit, and she appears somewhat reluctant to recognize minor faults in herself. Given this apparent tendency to repress undesirable characteristics, the interpretive hypothesis in this report should be reviewed with caution.
With caution, yes.
Okay. And then at the end of that paragraph, it says, client's tendency to avoid negative or unpleasant aspects of herself.
Yes.
Okay. And then I think the last part here under clinical features there, it says some denial or defensiveness is likely to be responsible for the generally trouble-free picture that she is reporting.
Sure.
Okay. However, in your report and what you just testified to on direct, specifically, you concluded or opined that you thought Miss Brophy was a forthright individual. You actually said the word forthright. Is that to mean truthful up front?
With some inconsistencies, she tended to, but in my report, I'm saying the same thing. She tended to present herself as being relatively free of minor faults. There's no evidence to suggest this is an intentional effort to distort the profile.
Right. When you testified on direct, Ms. Weinmiller asked you if you formed an opinion about Miss Brophy. And one of the things that you said about her was that she was forthright. In fact, it says right in your report, she is forthright, generous, and a creative woman. It doesn't say anything about any self-serving statements.
And if we ignore the MMPI-3, which is better data,
Go to the summary of your opinion on page 1 of your report. Got that?
yes.
Summary of opinions, number 1, Miss Crampton Brophy is a product of her time and generation. She is forthright, generous, and a creative woman. Where do you qualify that term forthright when you say that?
Predominantly from the collateral documents from others who knew her.
No, where do you write that in here?
Predominantly from the collateral documents of people who had, in the portion underneath collateral documents.
Does it say it there, under your opinion, your conclusion, what Miss Weinmiller just asked you about when she said, did you conclude the personality traits of Miss Brophy? You said yes. Is that not an accurate summary then?
It is an accurate summary, but again, you're using the MMPI, which has got problems, and the
I'm not asking you about
follow-up.
the MMP, I'm asking about what you are saying.
Sure, and
Your
based on
conclusion.
an overview of all of the data, I would say that in general, yes, she's forthright.
But then you say in the PAI that the respondent may not have answered in a completely forthright manner.
Because of the inconsistencies.
Okay, so she's forthright, but she's not forthright.
Well, and you have to understand what triggers on the inconsistencies. So it's the PAI is set up in such a way that people say, this statement is false, slightly true, mainly true, or very true. And you will see some elevations of the inconsistencies, but even on the PAI, the elevations that you gave me, the elevations are not in a clinical range, they're still subclinical. They're elevated, but they're not in a clinical range. So again, anyone could have those kind of elevations. But in general, as a whole, there's this, as the picture, as this one piece of data, if we only take the MMPI, yes. If we only take the PAI, yes. However, we have to incorporate the MMPI-3, which is a updated, in my opinion, better validated instrument. And her relationships say that, she tends to say what she thinks. And in that my term, that's my thinking is forthright as well, is that there's not there is a tendency for her that there's one of the quotes is that if she thinks it, it kind of comes out of her mouth when she's processing. And there's this lack of guile in it.
Quote that came from a defense investigative report of one of Nancy Brophy's friends.
It was one of her friends, yes.
Okay. And nonetheless, so are you saying we shouldn't, because the MMPI 2 doesn't look good for Miss Brophy, so we shouldn't look at that, and the PAI doesn't look good, so we shouldn't look at that, we should only look at the MMPI 3?
No, what I am saying is that even on the MMPIs, there is the caveat that you have to bring in your clinical judgment because the MMPI 2 is based on actuarial data, Antier and King, which was later found in the research to not be consistent or valid, which is why it didn't take off. It wasn't replicated in other areas. When we look at the MMPI-3, which is a better validated, a newer version, an updated version of the MMPI, then we need to consider that. The other piece is that even with, so I said earlier that if we have something that is in the positive impression management, it lowers the scores. Her scores aren't lowered. There isn't the positive impression management is still in a subclinical realm. Her negative impression management is still in a subclinical realm. Her subscales are all below average. So even if we were going to elevate them, there's nothing there to elevate. I'm not saying we don't. I'm just saying it is one point of data among many.
Even though, based on her responses, she could create, quote, somewhat an accurate impression.
Even though, when someone is, as I said, I've been doing this for over 20 some odd years, and a positive impression management is very much the norm within a forensic population. She does not have elevations on her positive impression management. She had some inconsistencies, and something that can trigger that can be something as simple as do you like to eat a large Sunday dinner? And if one time you say slightly true and the next time you say mainly true, that's going to pop up as an inconsistency.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about the hair psychopathy checklist that we talked about, that we now have these 3 pages for. And this is the actual checklist that you use.
Do you have 3 or 4? Or is it a front and back? One should be front and back.
2
Two
of them
should
are
be
front
front
and
and
back.
back. Yeah, 2 should be front and back.
And this is what you provided to us this afternoon.
Yes.
And I really want to just kind of focus on how you. I guess I'll ask you this. This is a pretty subjective test, correct?
I I don't think it is as objective as you subjective. I don't think it is as subjective because you still have to have the data to put it in the maybe or yes. It's you don't assume it's no. You just assume that there is. You have to look at the data, see does it fit does it fit this criteria for this question or for this trait.
Okay, so not being a subjective test, we would expect that another psychologist could look at this data that you have, fill out the same form, when we get the same answers.
There's always going to be variation, but
Is that because it's subjective?
I wouldn't say it's because it's subjective. I would say that there is always going to be variation anytime you're talking about human beings, but I would still be very surprised if anybody scored this and put her in a clinical range.
Great, let's talk about that. So you said on number 1, under glibness and superficial charm, you just said no. So based on what?
I don't find anything in the police reports or in any of the collateral documents, my experience of her, I did not find her superficially charming. I found her intelligent. I found her direct, but superficially charming was not in that gram. And then I don't find anything in the collateral reports about her. I find there to be depth from what most of the people have reported about her.
Okay, well, hold on. You just said you based this on the same data that we just talked about, those 1 through 28. Is that correct? The 1 through
Yes.
28 items that we talked about.
Sure,
That did not include 5,000 pages of police reports.
that's true.
Okay, now you are including that.
I'm not including all of them because even the thousands of pages of police reports that were finding people who didn't know anything about anything. I mean, that,
What about the people that did?
sure. And the people who did that I could find or that I heard about all gave great praise to Dan Brophy or Chef Brophy.
Well, okay. The defense investigator reports of the friends of Miss Brophy gave a positive light. Is that correct?
That would be fair.
Did you talk to a single person outside of Miss Brophy?
No, I looked at the reports.
You didn't talk to a single person.
I looked at the reports
You looked at the defense reports.
and the police reports. I didn't find anything in the police reports that indicated that they thought she was deceptive or charming, or there's questions, but I didn't find anything that said that that she was superficial or glib. She seemed to be pretty direct.
Okay, sounds good. And then number 2, you said no grandiose self of worth because she made a single comment about not wanting to come to court.
Not because she made a single
That's
comment,
what
but
you said.
there was other data, but that was one of the parts that we considered was about that grandiose sense of self-worth goes to narcissism. And we were looking for, is there aspects of narcissism? Is there aspects of self-aggrandizement? And we couldn't find it. And we were thinking then what would be an example of why we didn't. And this was one example. It wasn't the universal example. It was one example.
Okay. And then, so it's, I guess on both of those, 1 and 2, it's just not possible then that either of those apply. That's what no means.
I'm sorry?
No, when you say no, it's not possible
It's not that it's not possible, it's that there's no evidence to support that those are there,
based on 28 items that you had.
based on the review of the police reports and the data that we had.
Right, for now you're adding in the police reports.
Again, we looked at all the data that we had.
So let me ask you about then the pathological lying. You answered no. Right?
Yes.
The data you had before you was that you actually did have lies, lots of them.
In what way?
Well, you had her interview, correct?
I had her history, yes.
You had all the police reports, now you're saying?
We had, I believe we had all the police reports that I was given. I'm assuming that they were all of them.
Okay. So if she told the police that she was at home, in bed, and had a conversation with her husband before he took a shower and went to work, and the police reports revealed that she was actually driving around downtown, caught on surveillance video at that time, would that not be a lie?
Not if we're talking about the time that they were interviewing. They interviewed between that 20 minutes and 4 hours.
We'll get to that. Is that not a lie?
It could be, but I find no evidence of pathological lying, which is that the long-term over and over. There's no reports from people who've known her long-term of her being dishonest.
Okay. So you also have the police reports where she doesn't disclose, from the testimony we've had in the courtroom over the past few weeks. She's not disclosing the multiple gun purchases that she had, but you read in the police reports that she actually purchased a ghost gun build kit and that she purchased a Glock 17 9mm at a gun show and that she purchased a Glock 17 slide and barrel on eBay.
Sure.
But those weren't disclosed. Is that not lies?
But again, you're asking about during a time when she has just found out that her husband has died.
I'm not talking about that.
Are you talking about the later interview?
I'm talking about her not disclosing to multiple friends and families about the fact that she's purchased firearms.
That seems like a stretch to me. If she had told no one, maybe, but that doesn't seem like that would be a point that she would tell everyone. Let me give you an example. Early in my career, when attorneys wanted me to understand something, they sent me documents. So I didn't go around telling my family, oh, by the way, I just had an attorney send me how to make meth or how to make a silencer or how to make a bomb. It just doesn't come up in the conversation.
Okay. So what about her lying to her friends about where she was that morning?
And that is, again, was it a lie or is it part of the disruption that goes from being interviewed at a time when it's the worst time?
Well, again, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
But assuming there's not a disruption, right? Let's just assume for a moment, hypothetically, there's no disruption. Because we're going to talk about that. If she's telling essentially anybody who's asking or talking to her about it, that I was at home in bed the morning that Dan was murdered, and you know that she's not, are those not lies?
Not necessarily. If there is she's going, oh Dan, what am I going to do without Dan? What am I going to do without Dan? Now they begin to ask her questions. It's a disruption. It is a movement from where her brain was, which is part of, again, it's part of the read technique that we use in this country in terms, but you've got somebody who's trying to formulate here, and when you try to redirect them somewhere else, they may not always be accurate. That doesn't necessarily mean lies. It may be that they're just trying to give the best information they can at that point in time and putting things together.
Kind of lost me there for a second. So let's assume that Miss Brophy's having a conversation 2.5 months after the murder.
Mm-hmm.
She's having a conversation with her cousin. Her cousin says, hey, where were you that morning? It's a natural conversation.
Sure.
Nancy goes, oh yeah, I was at home in bed. That's not a lie?
It might not be a lie. It might be, but it might not be.
So if that's a maybe, and we have all these lies adding up that are maybe,
You've
is
got
it
a point
not?
in time. It still does not qualify as a pathological lying.
okay. So really what I want to just kind of finish up with this hair report. That you scored her at a 58. You said yeah, we're not really concerned until we hit a 61. Is that right?
One category was in a 58, but the overall total is a 61. I mean, sorry, the overall total was much lower. When we scored on the, using a harsher scale, we did hit a 58 on facet 2.
Right. So the bottom line is, no matter how you score this thing, based on what you're telling this jury today, she's not a psychopath.
She does not meet the criteria that would qualify as that, no.
Okay.
Would you like to know what the Harris says for in terms of pathological line of what meets the criteria?
I think if your conclusion is that she's not a psychopath, that's really all we're concerned about.
Right. But again, each group has a specific outline, and given Harris' specific outline, she doesn't meet
I'm
criteria.
going to try to move on, but if your defense attorneys think that that's important information, they can cover that on redirect. Okay, so you talked about, let's see, cognizant of our time here. You talked about the DV, domestic violence relationship, and you talked about the definition of what it is to be in a domestic violence relationship. And it was kind of a long definition, but it started off with a pattern. Does all domestic, to be classified as a domestic violence relationship, does there have to be a pattern of those different types of, I know it doesn't have to be physical violence, it could be emotional, psychological. Does there have to be a pattern, or is a one-time, say, violent episode, does that classify it as domestic violence?
To meet the definition put out by the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the National Institute of Mental Health, quote, it's a pattern of coercive control.
So one act is not
Would not fit
considered
the
to be-
criteria.
So if a couple had no violence, psychological, emotional abuse between the two for their whole relationship, but one shot the other, that wouldn't be a domestically violent relationship.
Well, that's why the Hare psychopathy checklist came in, was because under what conditions could you find that? If the person was, and my answer was, if the person was a psychopath, that could be done, which is why we then scored the Hare.
So if they're a psychopath that is domestically violent?
No, if it is there could be, if a person is a psychopath, they could have no domestic violence and have this one act. Now, is it an act of domestic violence? Yes. Does it meet the criteria of a definition of a domestically violent relationship? No.
Well, that's what I want. That's what I want to focus on.
Okay.
Right. I don't think we're talking about the Hare report anymore. We're talking about what it when you conclude this is not a domestically violent relationship.
Historically, no, that's correct.
What you're saying is even if you knew that Nancy Brophy shot and killed her husband, you still would say this is not a domestically violent relationship.
I would say that the conditions whereby that could be met would be if a person was a psychopath.
I feel like I'm not getting a straight answer.
I know, but you're
Would
asking
you
about
say-
a one point in time. Does that meet the definition that is put out by the Department of Justice? No, it's a pattern of coercive behavior. The other thing is I talked earlier about that triangle. And the triangle, you don't go from nothing to murder without there being levels of violence. It just doesn't happen.
Okay, hold on. You're saying somebody is incapable of committing murder without other levels of violence?
I am saying that,
Because that wasn't my question.
sure, no, I get that. How do you, are they incapable? That's a good question. The one condition whereby you could have that, in my opinion, as an expert on domestic violence, is if the person was a psychopath. I can't see how you escalate, because all of the violence that we have studied has always been an escalation of violence. Which, like I said earlier, the level of physical violence within even domestically violent relationships, the level of physical violence was less than 6%. The vast majority of violence that goes on in a domestically violent relationship is psychological and verbal. And then you have, again, property damage, sexual violence, physical violence. So you're talking about, again, going from 0 to the apex of that.
That can't happen.
I'm not saying it can't, not anything is possible. Is it probable? No. Is it possible that there's life on Mars? It's possible. Is it probable? No. But it could, anything is possible. Is it probable given statistically? No.
I'm sorry, are there not studies out there of people who are not historically violent, but they essentially get to the end of their rope
Sure.
and
And so,
then they kill?
well, if you're talking about like Angela Brown's work on battered women kill. So again, there are those for in terms of battered women. Michael Johnson talks about the violent resistor. And again, when the partner is an intimate partner terrorist, you've got the violent resistor. Will be in that category. It's very, the other thing is that when we talk about male violence, for example, the most likely murderer of a woman is her male partner. The most likely murder of a man is another man, statistically speaking. So is it impossible? No. Is it improbable without there other being conditions? I would say yes. Improbable. Yeah.
Okay. So that's your answer to my question of if you knew Nancy Brophy walked in and shot and killed her husband, that this is not a domestically violent relationship?
If I knew, if there was,
Can you just say yes or no?
no, unfortunately, too often I can't. Would you say it one more time and I will try?
Based on the definition of what it means to be a domestically violent relationship, if you knew that Nancy Brophy walked in, shot her husband, lives or dies, let's just either,
Right.
that you would say that is not what would meet the definition of a domestically violent relationship.
It doesn't meet the criteria of a pattern of coercive control characterized as defined by the National Institute of Justice, or Department of Justice.
So no, you would not define it as a domestic violent
I
relationship.
would definitely define it as a domestically violent act, but not a, I will say it doesn't fit the criteria.
Okay. So your conclusion that Ms. Weinmiller had asked you about this being a domestic violent relationship would be the same.
That Ms. Weinmiller had asked about, it'd be the same.
It would be the same.
Yes.
Thank you.
Is that the end of cross-examination, or are you
Oh,
looking?
no.
Okay, all right, I wasn't sure. All right,
Just looking at my notes.
okay.
I guess I'll ask you, it's fair to say that not all domestic violence murders are people who have a history of abuse.
No, I think that most we can see an escalation, except for when the battered woman murders him. We can see typically an escalation.
Listen to the question.
Okay.
Not all domestic violence murders are people who have a history of abuse. Is that correct?
It's possible, yes.
Is it correct? Or is it not?
I would say statistically, it is incorrect. Is it possible? Yes.
So yes.
It's possible, yes.
Okay. People that are not in a domestically violent relationship, such as you have concluded with the Brophies, you've decided, at least up to the point, well, I guess your answer is that it still was not a domestically violent relationship, but at least arguably up to the point where the violence started, okay? You're saying there's nothing in any of the records that you have that would suggest they're in a domestic violence relationship, right?
There's nothing I found, yes.
Yeah, and it doesn't appear that anybody has testified or concluded that elsewhere, right? There's no other information that you have that would suggest that they were in a domestic violent relationship.
That would be correct.
Okay. And does that, in your professional opinion, that type of relationship, one where there doesn't appear to be any domestic violence, and emotional, physical, psychological, anything, would you expect there to be more trust between those two people?
Yes.
And would you expect those people to feel more comfortable around that person?
Sure.
And would they even feel a sense of security, specifically, say, when one sleeps? That, when they're going to be drifting off into dreamland, that being with somebody who's not domestically violent would make them feel more comfortable and secure in that time.
I would remember we made the distinction between domestically violent, unhealthy, and healthy. I'd say if it's a healthy relationship, that would be true.
Well, you opined that this was a healthy relationship too, so let's stick with that. A healthy, non-domestic violence relationship. Would that also create that sense of security
Yes.
as well as trust and comfort?
Yes.
And so when these, let's say two people are in their home alone, they would find some comfort that that other person is there.
Yes.
Okay. And when they're out in a strange area or a place not at home, that maybe they would feel that comfort having that other person there. That's a person that is sort of a safety net or security.
Yes.
Okay. Now you talked about some. Before I move on, sorry. I wanted to ask you. You referenced some text messages that you reviewed, and that helped form your opinions because that was one of the 28 pieces of collateral information that you had, correct?
Yes.
And you said you had how many pages?
I had 234 pages. I know that there's been other numbers promoted, but I had 234.
Let's show you something. Does this appear to be the format in which you received them?
Yes. Yes. Sorry.
About the same amount per page?
Some were shorter, some were longer, but yeah, in
I
general.
mean, just in general, the size of the boxes, stuff like that, did that appear to be what you reviewed?
Right. And it said, from Nancy or from Dan.
And you only had 241?
234.
234? Are you aware that there's actually 371 pages of text messages?
I'd heard that later, yes.
Okay, but you didn't get all those.
I got from 4:15 of 16 through 6:2 of 18.
Okay. So you mentioned that there was only one possible text message that could be taken as, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Could you re-describe that?
Yeah, so Gutman talks about the difference between a criticism and a complaint. A complaint is healthy, a criticism is not. And there was one that could be considered, I think, as a complaint, which was Daniel left the vehicle unlocked.
What about do you recall the text exchange about the windows being open?
No. What date is that one?
June 24th, 2017.
2017. Is that the same one? Is that where there's a period where there's, again, it's done in caps, and then she just reminds him that that there's things in the vehicle that may be important to not leave unlocked.
No.
Okay. No, I don't recall that one.
So I'm going to read you a text message, and then you tell me if that's changed your opinion.
Sure.
From Nancy, it says, remember when we said we were not, in all caps, going to open the windows? That we would put the AC on permanent hold for 2 days to deal with the heat differently? Who agreed? Who opened the windows? The house is hot as hell because you didn't tell me that you changed your mind, and foolishly I didn't check. Anne's response was, it was 61 degrees outside, 78 inside. Opening the windows brought down the temp until the outside temp rises. Sorry, I assumed you would close the 2 windows. Her response, except we had agreed to handle it differently. He writes back, sorry, all me. But don't you think we should let in as much cool air outside as possible? I'd open the back door if we had a screen. And she says, normally yes, but we agreed to try it in a different way for these 2 days. That's a great plan when everybody knows the plan. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a knockdown, drag-out fight by any means, but I want to make sure that when you say, I've read all of these text messages, that one, you have read them all, and two, that you're excluding things like those exchanges when you're making the statements that you did.
Well, but what are you seeing as, I'm not sure, let me reword that, I'm not sure what you're seeing in that as being abusive or controlling. I hear annoyance. I don't hear a disrespectful name calling. I don't hear contempt. I hear, again, a disagreement.
Sure, I don't think I used the word abusive, and I don't think you did either when you were describing the other text message. It sounded like a disagreement, annoyance, contempt, things like you said, right? Isn't that what you were describing when you were describing the other text message?
Well, they weren't, no, I was not, there wasn't contempt. That's the complaint piece. So the difference between a criticism and a complaint is a criticism is a missile at you. A complaint is, this is my view of it, this is my understanding of it. I thought this is how it was going to go. I hear that is more of a complaint, which is a healthy way of dealing with conflict, than a criticism.
What was
But-
the other text message?
Dan, again in caps, Dan, you left the vehicle unlocked, and then not in caps was, I keep important documents in there.
That's different.
Well, that would still be a complaint, not a criticism. There isn't a, Dan, you idiot, you did it again. There is this is the fact of what happened, and this is my concern. That's the complaint. That's a healthy way of addressing conflict. Healthy relationships don't have an absence of conflict. It's about how they handled it.
Sure, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that this isn't normal or healthy. That's certainly not what I'm getting at. I want to make sure that we're having all the information that you're purporting that you have, to make sure we understand that this is what you're basing it on.
Sure. And remember that I originally did most of this back in, a year ago. So I know my final report came to you 4/9. But what I tend to do is I do the interview and then I write it up because I'm doing my interviews on my laptop. So I use shorthand. I don't use good punctuation. I write it up in a readable fashion, and then it all goes together at the end. So I did read the 234 pages. I didn't see contempt in those pages. I didn't see name calling in those pages. I didn't see psychological abuse in those pages. I don't hear psychological abuse in the text that you read me.
Good.
I hear conflict, which is what happens when you have a relationship, but I don't hear contempt or criticism or.
Well, you're bringing up a good point that I wanted to touch on. We've had a lot of testimony about the perfect relationship it was, ideal relationship, all that type of stuff. Is it important for you when you're listening to that and you're taking that in as part of your consideration, right? And specifically you mentioned Susan Estrada, mentioning what an ideal relationship the Brophy's had. Is it not important for you to understand what that person's definition of a good relationship is?
Oh, it can be. I mean, yes. The caveat in that is that, and again, what are they comparing it to? So if it's a horrible relationship that they're comparing it to, it doesn't take much. If, though, it is a really good relationship, people will sense it. You sense things like when there's tension between people. You sense contempt, for example. You sense it. And so to not have that come up is notable.
Right, and that's what I guess I'm getting at is, we haven't had any. Well, let me ask you this: would you expect a couple that's been married for 20 plus years, been together for 25 plus years, to fight occasionally?
I would expect them at that point to have differences of opinion, and how they resolve that would be different than, say, people in the newlywed stage or people in the power struggle stage or people in the post-power struggle stage. So people, by the time that you're 20 years, the developmental progression is that at 20 years is intimacy. And so do they still have differences? Sure. Would they have it in a, can they do that in a respectful way? You would expect it if they were going to have lasted past, say, the 15-year mark.
Let me clarify. We had testimony and lots of reports about over the course of the 25-year relationship about how perfect it was. Are you saying, would you expect in 20-something years that people would argue?
Yes.
Okay. So if people aren't seeing that, nobody's reporting ever seeing a single argument. What does that tell you?
It tells me that they know how to handle differences without going into a fight.
So literally they don't ever argue?
By the time that couples can get to 20 years, that can be. But they've learned how to adapt. They've learned how to approach it. Because again, John Gottman's work was not the fights that are destroy a relationship, it's the how of the fights. And so you're still going to have differences, but how it's handled is different. That's what keeps a relationship going.
Well, I'm not trying to hide the ball here. Is it true that you would expect throughout the course of the relationship, not at 20 years, not at 25 years,
Sure.
throughout the course of the relationship, people are going to argue. If nobody's seeing that, is it fair to say that those arguments are likely happening outside the presence of others?
Well, but what I've heard, or what I understand people to have said was that there was compromise, and that's how you handle conflict. That doesn't mean that you're not having conflict, but you're compromising. You're not getting into the weeds. You're not getting into the fight, as it were. You're addressing the issue.
You brought up John Gottman. He was working with couples, correct?
Yes, and then in the 90s, he and Neil Jacobson worked with domestically violent men.
So
Yes.
all that data you talked about, all the conclusions of his work, when he had a chance to talk with both people in the relationship.
Yes. Well, and actually, his analysis was less of him talking to both because he had videotaped the couples talking to each other, and that's what he watched.
So he had videotapes of them before. You can do the update with both of them now.
He had what he called his love labs, which was apartments outside the University of Washington. He had, I think it's the 70s. He had young married couples come in. They spent the weekend there. He videotaped them. He did different aspects of research. Then after 30 years, he went back and tracked those couples down to find out if they were still together or not. He took those videotapes from those newlywed days, put them in groups, and analyzed them to see if there were markers of, because he knew now, 30 years later, if they'd stay together, how long, and he began to analyze what are the markers of how long they stayed together. So he didn't go back and interview them other than to find out if, are you still together? How long are you separated or divorced? How long were you together? And then analyzed the videos that he had, because he was wondering if there's markers in that initial newlywed period that was predictive of divorce or healthy relationships.
Gotcha. In any of his subjects, did he have the opportunity to analyze one where the spouse murdered the other?
Well, he did analyze it. Interestingly, he did find a subset because at one point he was doing different research with a different group, and he would always have people hooked up to heart monitors and pulse oximeters, and he did find that for some people, for most of us, when we got into a conflict with our partners, our heart rates went up. But he found that there was a small subset that actually, and again, this was more like along the psychopath, their heart rates went down. They went calmer. And so he and Neil Jacobson came up with the Cobra and the Pit Bull as the typologies. So were they murders? Obviously not. But who you're talking more about is Angela Brown's work, When Battered Women Kill. And she, again, had her population, but then she wasn't looking at the relationship other than to assess for domestic violence within the relationship.
I wasn't talking about the battered women. I was talking about John Gottman's studies. And what you're saying, you said obviously none of the spouses had killed the other one. So he didn't have a chance to study any of those.
He did not.
All right, I'm going to move on to what you talked about in trauma. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I do that, really briefly, you defined domestically violent relationship. That is a different definition than the legal definition of domestic violence, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And so when you talked about trauma, and this will go back, we'll talk more about what Ms. Brophy talked about in her interview with the detectives. First of all, you premised a lot of what you said on the idea that Ms. Brophy was interviewed by the police within 40 minutes of being notified of her husband's death.
Well, she shows up, and then
It's
she's...
a yes or no question.
Yes. Initially, yes.
She was interviewed by police within 40 minutes of being told that her husband had been killed.
I believe so, yes.
Okay, where did you get that information?
From the initial interview, meaning that she shows up at the school, they interview her and inform her. That's part of, I believe, I don't know if that's the death notification, but I believe that they give her the information that it was her husband that was killed. She's asking if it's a school shooting, those sorts of things. And so she begins to ask questions. And that would have been within minutes of being notified. Then they go to her house. She allows them to drive her.
Hold up. I'm talking about, I just asked you about how long it was from the time she's notified of the death
It was very quickly, yes.
to the time she's interviewed. Okay, but that's not true, is it?
Excuse me?
That's not true, is it?
But they interviewed her quickly?
Isn't it true that she wasn't notified of Dan's death until 7 minutes into the death notification?
Oh. She does show up, she does ask questions. And yes, there's some time before they say Dan is the one who was shot. But she's also thinking it's a school shooting, 7 minutes, okay.
Now, I want
It's
to
still within that quick time period.
make sure we have our timeline correct.
Sure.
Because when you start talking about 20 minutes to 4 hours and all that, I want to make sure we got our time frame right. So the interview or death notification, it's the same thing, correct? Okay, you
Yes.
have one recording of Miss Brophy, who after she arrives on scene, she's ushered into the scene, she's there for a few minutes, and then she's brought into a van where she's interviewed. And that's where the recording starts. And that's
Yes.
what you've listened to, correct?
Yes,
And at the beginning of that, very beginning, the detectives explained to her that they just want to talk to her and that they're going to record it, right?
yes,
And that it's not until 7 minutes into that where they say, we believe that it's Dan, it's your husband, that's been shot inside.
sure. And if you're starting the counter at that point, then yes, you're correct.
If I'm starting to counter,
Yeah, you're counting the timeline. But if the timeline starts with her getting a text saying, hey, something's going on at the school, or the timeline starts with the last text I saw, which was, Dan, what's going on June 2nd? If that's the counter, then there's more gap for the time period.
okay, well, let's take a step back then. What's the traumatic event in Miss Brophy's morning? What is, when you refer to trauma, when she's experiencing trauma, at 20 minutes to 4 hour time frame starts, what is the traumatic event?
I would wonder if the traumatic event starts with, hey, something's going on at OIT, there's been a shooting.
Okay, I'd prefer if you not wonder, but in your professional opinion, determine when you believe, when you're in your professional opinion, when you believe the traumatic event began or happened.
With the shooting.
You think her traumatic event started with the shooting that she had no idea even happened?
I think the traumatic event starts with, hey, what's going on at the school? Here's why. For any of us, if, let's make it a school shooting. If we hear about a school shooting, the first thing we want to know is what school? Was it our school? Was our children there? So that already begins that whole adrenaline rush. Then she texts Stan, Deanne, what's going on? Or what, I can't remember the exact quote, but the last text is her texting Dan, asking him what's happening. And then there's nothing. And for most of us, for me, I would think for most people who've been in long-term relationships, a little bit of panic starts to set in, even if it's not my child or my husband, because now I know that my child or my husband may have experienced something and I'm concerned. That's a human caring response.
And that has that negative balance, the suddenness, and the lack of control.
Sure.
So that's the trauma that Nancy experienced.
It's the beginning of it. And then it's trauma on trauma on trauma. Then there's the discovery that there's been a death, and there's a discovery that Dan is the one who is dead. And then there is the family that comes, and then there's 3 weeks later, there's the death of her brother. Then there's that by the time they're interviewed several months later, all of memory is pliable.
Who's interviewed several months later?
Well, just in terms of there's so much that is going on for her, but I think the trauma for her that morning starts when she text Dan, what's going on? And there's no response.
That's the
And
trauma.
that's the beginning of it. And then it escalates.
So at what point do you start that 20-minute clock?
I would think the adrenaline would start if their history is that they both will tend to respond as quickly as they can. It appears that they can. I would think that that trauma begins at about the time the adrenaline starts going at about the time that there's no response.
Okay.
And then she drives. And again, she's a problem solver. She's trying to figure it out. And then let's talk. They, as you said, pull her aside and begin to talk to her.
So, and I guess when you're saying that's the beginning of the trauma, you're presuming that that means that Dan texts Nancy back.
No. She texts him and then there's no response. That's the end of the text messages.
Well, I know. Obviously, he didn't text back. I'm saying you're assuming that he does text back, like normally.
Normally.
Like she would expect him to text her back.
Sure.
And let me just put this into perspective. He's teaching a class, supposedly, at the time that she's texting him. Wouldn't it be reasonable to think he might not text me back immediately?
Sure, but if you're anxious, if your adrenaline's starting to go, if you're starting to wonder what's going on, again, the frontal lobe is already becoming detached. You're starting to act on fear, concern. And given the history of school shootings in our country, that is not an unreasonable thought. If it had never happened again before, then it would be like, what's going on? But we've had, unfortunately, too many. So there's this idea that, Dan, what's going on? And then I don't get a response, so now I'm going to drive down there. But there is, I think, the trauma starts with the not knowing.
So do you think that starts that clock?
I think that would start the clock.
Okay, so within 20 minutes, she might not be forming memories anymore.
Within 20 minutes, she might be attempting to understand the world that has now changed, that's possible has now changed. And then once the notification goes, the world has changed.
And that's not for, from the time that she's notified that there was a shooting at the school, or she sends that text message that goes unanswered, to the time she's being interviewed, now we're talking more like 40 minutes. Mm-hmm. So is that what you're talking about?
Well, again, the 20 minutes to 4 hours is
I'm talking about the time you said that.
The memories aren't being formed?
No, you said that she's being interviewed within 40 minutes of being notified of the death. That turns out not be true. So I'm talking about when the 20 minutes to 4 hours begins, you're saying that that's after that text message, right?
It's once you're making trauma a nice, neat point in time, and it's not. So let's say hypothetically, she sends this text message, she gets to the school, and it turns out it was a false alarm. Nothing had really happened. It was a backfiring on a car, right? Now all of the resources are going to start to regroup. The adrenaline's going to go down, the cortisol is going to go down. They might laugh because people got revved up over a car backfiring. Now, again, it's not added on top of each other, but that's not how this nightmare starts. This nightmare starts with there's a text message and he's not responding. There's this notification from a friend that something's going on.
Sure. No, I think that makes sense.
yeah.
It's building up one bad thing after another that's not.
But to say that this is the exact point in time, I'm not sure that the science is refined enough yet to be able to say when that starts or how quickly it starts.
Okay, and I guess I didn't mean to sort of lock you into that. I'm just trying to identify a general point in time that we can point to when you're saying 20 minutes to 4 hours is when we're going to maybe have that hard time of having memories of what's happening, because all this stuff is flying at us so much. And so I think I won't lock you into the time of the text message, but at least starting then, we might start to expect that at that point, Ms. Brophy is going to be having trouble, possibly, depending on how she reacts to things. Everybody's different. Mm-hmm. But depending on how she reacts, we might then start to see some of those issues with the memories.
Yes.
To the point of, if she said, well, I'm having a hard time remembering the interview that I had with the detectives. That would be normal to you. That would be a usual response that you would expect.
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Now, if she said, I remember talking to the detectives, I remember some of the things I told them, I just don't remember all of them, that would also be normal?
Yes.
Okay. Because she's able to formulate some of those memories, even though she's in that 20 minutes to 4 hour period.
Sure. And remember, traumatic memory is like snapshots.
Sure.
Not a linear narrative.
Okay. And let's say, it's not long after she's talked to the detectives that she's back at the house giving the detectives a gun. If she were to recall that event, saying, say she's telling somebody else, the morning of the homicide, I gave them this gun, I bought it, I didn't want it. It would be understandable or normal that she would have that memory.
Sure.
Okay. So what you're really talking about is when you have this traumatic experience, you're talking about the time moving forward, about the trouble that one might have forming memories. That's really what all this is to say.
Yes.
Okay. But you would expect, kind of no matter what the trauma is, that really after about 4 hours, you should at least start to come out of that. I mean, of course, I'm not locking you in a hard time, but about that time, you would expect somebody to start to kind of be able to regain their ability to start forming memories again.
Again, it depends on the severity of the trauma.
Sure.
And so, if, for example, if somebody goes flat, no emotion, then after about 4 or 6 hours, then you would expect them to say, perhaps start to weep or to have the more of the emotional reactions. The memories, again, whether or not they got wired into the long-term memory, hardwired into a long-term, will vary.
Sure. So,
Well, Ed, not to cut you off, but we are now at 5:15. So why don't we take our break? And when I say break, we'll end for today. And we'll be back in place at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Okay, well, record on. Thank you. You may be